Hi, I'm Stephanie Becker, and welcome to my case study, Copyright and the Computer Regulations Governing Technology. First off, let's go ahead and summarize the case and what's happening in the situation. So, first of all, who is involved? That would be Mr. Sample, who is the principal who I will be taking on as a role, Mrs. Lynn, who is a computer library assistant, Mrs. Brandon, who is a teacher in the building. Mrs. Williams is a teacher in the building. Mrs. Evans is the PTA president. We're also have St. Regis School District involved, St. Regis other teachers that weren't mentioned, but also were mentioned as a part of being involved, and the computer software company. So, when and where did things happen? After 4 months of following the computer lab schedule, several teachers approached Mrs. Lynn on wanting her to copy some of the computer software programs for their individual usage in their classrooms. Mrs. Lynn made copies of the programs in the computer lab in the library and then passed those out to the teachers individually. What didn't happen? As far as we know, Mrs. Lynn was not trained about copyright laws and policies. I thought maybe this was possibly because Mr. Sample assumed that she knew about them, as she was previously a computer assistant or computer lab assistant. And Mrs. Lynn did not acquire permission from Mr. Samples before she started to make copies and distribute those. And so he was not aware that she was copying the software programs. So, what has exactly happened? St. Regis is a small school located in a rural area. It serves 420 students from kindergarten through 8th grade. Financial support for the school comes mainly from two large fundraisers that's put on by the PTA and supported by the PTA. This year, the money will be used to purchase new software. Mrs. Lynn, a part time computer assistant, has been hired to replace a retired library media specialist. The computer software programs were ordered and used with computers in the lab. Several teachers approached Mrs. Lynn with an idea of how to better utilize the new programs. Mrs. Lynn agreed to copy computer software programs for individual teachers' use in their own classroom and on their own classroom computers to increase what they felt would be more access for students and student usage. Mrs. Lynn, when she goes to pass out those programs, is met with some resistance when she was passing them on by a teacher named Mrs. Brandon, who had previous experience in another school, who had some strong copyright policies as a school itself that were reinforced. And so she refused to accept that jump drive. She also was met with by Mrs. Williams, who was very supportive of it, a veteran teacher in her school. But given Mrs. Brandon's concerns, she went ahead and sought out her principal, Mr. Samples, and asked for his advice on what he thought she should do. Mr. Sample followed up with a meeting with Mrs. Lynn the following day and shares that what she's doing is a violation of copyright and could mean serious consequences for the school, the district, as well as herself. He asked her to collect the copies and to not make any more. And Mrs. Lynn becomes defensive and doesn't believe that anyone would even know that that copyright was violation was happening because of the rule setting that they are living in, as well as she felt like she was doing what was best for students. So, legal and ethical issues that I felt like were involved within this case and what was happening. Legal issues that I see happening is that Mrs. Lynn has violated copyright laws and could be prosecuted. The district, I felt, could also be found at fault for copyright infringement. And then Mrs. Lynn may all have also disregarded, this was something that was an unknown, I wasn't for sure, but if there are district policies, that's something that she has also disregarded. Ethical issues that I see, school districts should develop policies because that helps provide their staff with guidance and guidelines to be able to follow. Ethically, Mrs. Lynn should know that there are copyright laws. Even if the school could go unnoticed, it's not ethical no matter what. And I feel like in this day and age, we are seeing enough things everywhere on TVs and on the internet talking about copyright laws. That's not something that I feel would just be easily ignored. It is Mr. Samples, my responsibility as principal to be able to communicate those laws, policies, and regulations. And so if I have not done that as a leader, then I am guilty for that and have not followed through with my duties as a principal. Harmful effects that I see would be definitely the future success of Mrs. Lynn in her position. If she's prosecuted, she's not going to be able to possibly have a position, or she may be released. I also see harmful effects being just the future success and well-being of our students, because as we've researched in some of our other cases, it is our job as educators to model that appropriate usage for our students. And if they're seeing us copy things illegally, then that's not setting a good example for them, as well as brings back into those ethical issues. I also feel that the software company has been harmed, because if we do not destroy those copies, they are losing out on money. And I just wanted to include that the seriousness of those fines, and this was from 2001 of Simpson in 2001. So obviously that's been a few years, but fines for copyright infringement at that time could be as high as 150,000 for each occurrence, and up to 250,000 if computer software is involved. So, synthesizing the situation, Mrs. Lynn, the new computer assistant, illegally copies computer software in an effort to help teachers without first consulting with the principal, Mr. Samples. So, are the things that we maybe feel like we still don't know? And what are the things that we for sure know and are evident? What are the facts that we're looking for? So, we know that Mr. Samples is in his fourth year of being principal, who feels like he's just beginning to establish himself and getting supported by that community and those community of stakeholders. He is made aware of the issue that has happened by Mrs. Brandon. Mrs. Brandon was approached with a copy from Mrs. Lynn and refused, and then informed Mr. Samples of that issue. Mrs. Lynn is a waivered library computer assistant. She was hired as a waiver because they couldn't find a library media specialist to replace the retired media specialist. She illegally copied computer software and passed on to teachers. Mrs. William is a veteran third grade teacher who is thankful for those copies to use. Mrs. Evans is the PTA president who, in a conversation, ended up helping Mrs. Lynn in making those copies and thought that it was a great idea to go ahead and stretch that PTA money. Other people that are involved through this situation, it had said that several St. Regis teachers had approached Mrs. Lynn and asked for software copies to be made in order to make things easier and things more accessible and available for their students instead of only during that scheduled computer time. Other people involved would be the PTA, that parent faculty committee who helps sponsor the fundraisers and provides funding for that software. And then obviously our students, those 420 kindergarten through eighth grade students are definitely people who are going to be affected by these decisions and affected by what programs are available to them. Unknowns, we do not know the involvement of the superintendent in this situation. We also do not know what the community, if the community sponsors are aware or if they're involved. We know that the PTA with Mrs. Evans does have knowledge of that, but I started to wonder, what are those sponsors who are providing money during those fundraising opportunities? What are they going to say if they find out that we are misusing those funds? Other things to think about is also that software company. We don't know what company it is that was being used, as well as what their policies were on copyright of their materials. Did the St. Regis teachers take advantage of Mrs. Lynn's experience? This is something that I question because several of them have been there for a few years. Her being new to that position, not maybe being as knowledgeable as what they were, or not having degrees or being exposed. I just felt like that would be something that I wondered. Was the PTA made aware of the decision to copy software and stretch their funding? If they were, I would hope that, I would think that we need to make sure that we're bringing knowledge into those stakeholders to let them know that that's not something that is okay, and help us to look at different ways that we could possibly get more funding for that software that we're needing. And then also to think about is just what those student demographics are, how accessible is computers and the software for those students, what's the makeup, how when we look at areas and more rural areas, obviously there's less available for those districts and those schools. And so it also just made me think about within their own homes as well. So if we are going to evaluate those known and those missing facts, we can't just look at the people. We also have to look at the places and the programs. So St. Regis is a K-8 school. It is in a rural community that we know, 25 miles from a larger city, which is where their high school students attend. The community is composed of a couple grocery stores, a drugstore, as well as a few small businesses. Within the places that this took place in, it was the library as well as the computer lab and those individual classrooms that accepted the copies. Unknown things about place would be how many individual computers do each teachers have in a classroom, just to know how many illegal copies were being made, and do students have access to computer or iPads that they take home, and if so, that's opening up even more as far as that software being taken home and leaving the building. Programs that I wondered about, the knowns for that would be two major fundraising programs: Supply School financial support. We know that they have an active PTA program. The teachers submitted requests for software programs that they felt would be beneficial, and then those programs were taken and prioritized by Mr. Samples and Mrs. Lynn, who Mrs. Lynn then copied programs and were passed out to teachers. Unknowns, I wondered how many licenses were purchased from the software company. I also wondered if it was an overall purchase and then you could push out to numerous computers. I know that that's with some of our programs that we currently use in my district. With iPads, we can buy an overall licensing and then push out to different iPads. I wondered how many teachers accepted the copied programs. And then just wondered if there are current acceptable use policies or professional learning being provided when it comes to understanding copyright and the laws as they affect teachers. So if I am going to prioritize and then reflectively evaluate the situation. So currently the situation could be damaging, in my opinion, to all stakeholders. They all have a stake in the outcome of this situation. Those stakeholders include our teachers, our members of the community, our school board, our admin, parents, and students, because they all could possibly be affected by what happens in this situation. The district could be found at fault and held accountable for copyright infringement, which could prove to be costly for them. Teachers could also be found at fault and held accountable. It could affect future sponsorship, in my opinion, and fundraising of the school, knowing that funds were used inappropriately, thus affecting the future success and well-being of both our adults and students within our buildings. It could also be damaging to that community if the infringement is, say, picked up by a local news source and it makes media and news. It's going to bring a lot of bad karma, tarnishing the reputation of the school district. Have all relevant stakeholders been consulted? In my opinion, no. I feel like this is definitely an area where administration and the school board and superintendent need to be consulted, and they have not in this situation. I also wondered about legal counsel, just because if we would happen to end up in a situation where we were legally liable or a case was pursued, I felt like I wanted to be prepared with that information so that I wasn't broadsided when and if something happened. More information that I would still like to know about is if that school has the acceptable use policies, and did the staff receive professional learning on acceptable use. Even with that information missing, I still feel like I have enough information in order to make a decision on what I would do for the next step in this case, acting as Mr. Samples, the principal. So in looking at my options as a principal, option one, I, as the principal, might be afraid of losing my status quo, and might choose to allow the teachers to keep and continue those use of illegal copies and just kind of turn my head and not acknowledge that that is happening. Option 2, I could collect all copies, appropriately dispose of the illegal copies, and then replace Mrs. Lynn in her position, so letting her go. Option 3, I would seek guidance from my superintendent, collect all the copies of all the illegal copies, write up Mrs. Lynn for the illegal usage in her personnel file, dispose of the illegal copies, develop acceptable use policies to be included in our staff handbook, provide yearly professional learning on acceptable use, post informational graphics about copyright laws in the workroom spaces where people are going to see them. It's going to be out there in their face so that it's something that is constant and is being reinforced in their minds when they think about doing something like that. My last option that I considered was contacting the software company to ask permission to use the copied software within individual classrooms before acting upon anything else. So in evaluating those plans, we always have to look at our pros and cons and see which one outweighs which. Option 1, where I didn't do anything and I let them continue with the copies, our pros would be that we'll have multiple copies of resources to further increase the future success and well-being of our students. Mr. Samples will not mess with the status quo, and the PTA will be pleased that we have stretched their resources. Cons that I see: legally, we are not following the laws, policies, and regulations on copyright. Ethically, we are not being responsible leaders for our students. Thus, we are not increasing the future success and well-being of our students. The district and teachers could be found guilty of copyright infringement, which harms the future well-being and success of adults in our district. Costly ramifications for teachers as well as the district, and then just that it negatively impacts those stakeholders within the community, thus affecting possibly our future sponsorship. Option 2 pros: the district will have handled the illegal copies appropriately. They will avoid being sued for copyright infringement and hopefully hire a certified media specialist. Cons to this one: not for sure on what Mrs. Lynn's contract looked like, but we may be in breach if we choose to terminate her during the middle of the year. Mrs. Lynn is let go for something that she didn't understand without an opportunity to make things right. To me, that's an ethical issue. I don't think that it's fair that we take her position away from her because I, as the principal, did not make sure she was aware of those laws. Other cons: staff aren't really being informed of laws and policies in this stance and regulations, which means they may just continue to repeat those offenses. We may not be able to find anyone to replace Mrs. Lynn, and the teachers and PTA might be upset with me because I didn't allow those copies. Option 3 pros would be the district will have handled the illegal copies appropriately. The superintendent is made aware of the situation. We avoid being sued for copyright infringement. School acceptable use policy is created to communicate laws and regulations to all staff. Mrs. Lynn keeps her position, but she receives professional learning to improve her skills, promoting her future well-being. The district will not be fined for costly infringement, and we will also save our reputation with key stakeholders for future support. Cons to option 3: obviously, it's going to take time to develop those acceptable use policies. Teachers in the PTA might still be upset with me because I'm not allowing those copies to be used. And I was also worried about teachers blaming Mrs. Brandon for coming to me as the principal. So I may have to, do some relationship building with staff in that circumstance. Option 4 was to contact that software company. If I was able to obtain permission for copies, we could use those within the buildings. My reputation would be maintained as far as with the PTA and with those teachers. Cons of that: the software company may tell me no, and then I'm in the same boat with no other plan. They also might be made aware, because I went to them, of illegal copies and pursued legal action against us. And again, in this case, no staff is informed of laws, of policies, and regulations, which in turn may mean that they repeat that offense. The option that I feel would be best, it would be in the best interest of myself as principal and my staff, is option 3. I feel that this option is the best decision because it allows me to improve my management, communication, technology, school level governance, and operation systems in order to develop equitable resource plans that apply laws, policies, and regulations to promote the student and adult success and well-being. This plan of improvement allows me to reflectively evaluate decisions that I have made and improve on communicating to staff about copyright laws by developing an acceptable use policy that supports school improvement. By applying the knowledge and skills we have learned through professional learning, my staff will understand laws and policies that help them to be strong leaders, thus increasing the success of their students. Implementation of the plan and how I would like to see it implemented throughout the year. I first off would meet with my superintendent to communicate the situation, making sure that he is aware in case any pending legal situation may arise or any concerns. I will personally collect all illegal copies immediately and dispose of them using the appropriate measures as detailed by our technology expert. Next, I will meet with Mrs. Lynn the following day, provide her with current copyright information to communicate the laws and regulations that we must follow as a district. I will also inform her that this will be reflected in her personal file and should not happen again. If it does, that will be grounds for dismissal. And I just wanted to include this quote from Simpson, 2001. The first step in a comprehensive copyright management program is to have a school board approved copyright policy. So that is my step number 4. I will work with members of my leadership team to develop and improve building acceptable use policies that communicate the laws, rights, and policies in regards to copyright in the classroom in order to ensure our future success as educators. We will seek board approval once developed. Simpson also stated that all personnel who might be involved in intentional or inadvertent infringement should receive training about their copyright rights and responsibilities. So, step 5, I will develop and advocate for data informed and equitable school resource plans by developing professional learning opportunities that communicate the laws and regulations. Professional learning will be provided throughout the year to teachers, administrators, as well as those community stakeholders to create a culture of understanding and application. And the reason I included those stakeholders is because I felt like the PTA needed to be involved in that decision, knowing that they were the ones helping to supply that fundraising. They also need to understand how those resources can appropriately be used. In implementing my plan, I had to always consider what other possible outcomes could happen, as well as having a backup plan in place and thinking of those people that need to be involved. So, possible outcomes that I have thought about was that staff will embrace the new policies and follow. Staff will embrace the new policies, but then fall into old habits, which we know happens with a lot of us because we slip back into those old patterns of behavior. I felt like this could be managed just by making sure we're giving that continual and consistent professional learning, reviewing, and seeing it. Copyright laws could change. And so, if that would happen, we would need to make necessary changes to our acceptable use policy that follows the new laws. And then I also had that Mrs. Lynn could continue to copy materials. And if that is the case, as I stated before, she will need to be let go. My plan B would be to continue with my plan that I had implemented, but I would like to increase that professional learning opportunities so it's more frequent and consistent. I also felt that it would be more powerful posting infographics by all machines to encourage users to follow school policy when it comes to copyright, ensuring policies are being equitably applied by making sure that we are writing up anyone who chooses not to follow policy so that we're treating everybody fair and equally. And persons I feel that need to be involved within these steps would be our superintendent, our administration, our school board, our staff, as well as our PTA. An implementation of my plan in correlation with our current standard. So this completed case study correlates to the standard because I was able to demonstrate my capacity to promote the current and future success and well-being of students and adults by applying knowledge and skills acquired through the course to develop a plan to better communicate and implement laws, regulations, and policies as they relate to copyright. As a future leader, it is my job to be able to reflectively evaluate operation systems and advocate for data informed and equitable resourcing plans that support school improvement and student development. This assignment was relevant to my current learning because it provided me with a real life experience that was relatable to something I could possibly face as a future leader. Throughout the case study, I was able to reflect upon the knowledge that I have learned in the course and how I would apply it to solve problems that may arise when I am a future leader. It will impact my future decisions because I feel like I am better prepared and equipped to handle difficult situations. I have a better understanding of copyright laws and what I can do to better communicate and implement laws, rights, and policies in order to promote the future well being of both adults and students within my building. Finally, this assignment has provided me with valuable practice on how I might handle copyright infringement within my building. It will impact me and how I go about communicating laws, regulations, and policies to ensure that all people in my building are receiving those equitable resources and information. First, I believe in providing frequent and consistent professional learning that provides my teachers with knowledge of laws and policies so I'm setting them up to succeed. A second takeaway that has impacted me is the importance of having district policies in place that give guidance and boundaries for staff to follow. This allows for effective communication across all staff. Currently, our district does not have any policies in place for copyright, and this is something that I would definitely like to see change in order to make sure we are helping to protect our staff, but also that we're modeling appropriate usage to our students. This promotes both the future well being of our adults and our students. And finally, as I wrap up, this is a reference that I referenced throughout my Module 12 case study. And I just want to say thanks for this class. I've learned so much and look forward to using it someday when I am an admin. Thank you.